Hey guys, how's it going? Sensational here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be featuring another 8 decks that you should be playing on ladder in the next 2 weeks leading up to the patch. There hasn't been that much movement in, I would say, like the top 3 decks of play rate as well as win rate, so we'll kind of quickly go over those. But there have been a few new decks that have sort of shifted into the meta because of the prominence of the top 3 decks. So if this is the first time tuning in to the channel, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the video, or if this is the first time leading into the sort of decks to play in the meta as well. I'll quickly just talk over all the decks and why I think they're good, and just the main components of them. So let's kick it off, starting with the first deck being Thralls. So Thralls, I think, requires very little explanation on what it does. Its main goal is just to combo off a lot of Thralls and burst attacking with them when they count down out of their frozen Thralls. So ideally you want to be cloning your frozen Thrall with promising features or Taliyahs, and then taking them down so that you get to open attack with them on your attack turn, which leaves your opponent with the least amount of response to deal with them. And then suddenly you're just attacking with 3/4 8/8 overwhelms, and it's actually very difficult to actually deal with it. It's very limited. You have to freeze. You basically can't survive on that swing because this deck runs 3 Rider negations. So if you're even like an Ezreal Annie deck and you get to disintegrate, kill 2 of them, because you're open attacking into your turn, you have the mana held up to play something like Deny. You can play 3 Sisters for a buff, or to entomb just a big blocker. It becomes just very difficult to actually deal with this deck once they have their Thralls coming out. And of course, with the addition of Harbinger of Thralls, which is the new 2-drop card that summons a Thrall, all of a sudden, landmark removal doesn't really serve the same purpose as it once did into this matchup, where now having 2 Thralls down early on board just threatens the ability to go off on either one of them. And if your opponent just decides to hold on to their landmark removal, then you can still just Taliyah like a pretty low countdown one, and all of a sudden they have 3 Thralls, whereas you only have 1 landmark removal. So this deck is definitely showing numbers. It is the most played deck right now, although I don't think its win rate really reflects on its overall power level. I think the deck right now is just very powerful and relatively uninteractive from a deck that I think is very good, which is a little bit annoying. But there will be some changes that have sort of been revealed coming up in the next patch at the end of the month, and I will talk a little bit briefly about those changes at the end of the video. So stay tuned, because that will be a little bit relevant for Thralls, although not sure exactly how. But Thralls, still the most played deck, still a very strong deck, and just a very good one overall. We'll talk about a few decks that have come into the meta as well to counter Thralls, but that'll be a little bit later into the video. So on to the next deck. So the next deck, I think without say, goes to the Elise Viego Noxus deck. This is the second most played deck when it comes to the meta, and still just a very powerful one added. Very similarly, like Thralls, it's not easy for many other decks to really beat or to control Viego decks, especially this one, because it just has 9 big-sided units that you really do need to deal with, being Viego, Hydrovine, as well as Legion Deserter, which can all just snowball the game once they're played and can't really be removed. And because they're so big, they generally require pretty expensive removal, something like a Vengeance, like a Disintegrate combo, maybe like a Ruination, things like that. But they can just spread out their threats pretty evenly, and it can just make it really annoying. This deck also comes in clutch at beating Thralls, because you can actually ramp up your units, ramp up your Viego, your Deserter, your Mists, so that you can generate enough units to chump block the Thralls, and then flip Viego and really turn the game over the corner. Of course, having access to Disintegrate and Vengeance also gives us some relatively premium removal that I think a lot of deck regions and combinations relatively lack. There's just a lot of value within this deck. There's a lot of card draw. There's a lot of big value units. There's good ways to close out the games, having access to Atrocity, and I think it's no wonder that this deck remains the second most played deck, as well as one of the most powerful ones out of there. some really interesting cards. There's like a Noxian Telestone splash in there. Having access to Whirling Death situationally can be very powerful, especially because given the size of your units. There's a Haunted Tomb tech here as well, again just providing you with one more late game threat, so you can bring back Viego, you can bring back Hydrovine, you can bring back just another big threat that can come at your opponent. These cards are a little bit flexy. You can put them in for other cards, but in this list I just saw it and I found it pretty interesting, so I just want to showcase that as an addition. The third deck, we have my deck that I climb to Masters with, and I think this deck has really just been popping off ever since the previous 2 weeks. People have really picked up on the power level of this deck, and it has just shown tremendous leaps in its play rate in the meta. And the reason for that, again, is just Fizz. As I mentioned, you have Thralls, and then you have Viego, which beats Thralls, and now you have the deck which beats Viego, being Fizz Riven. A very, very annoying combo deck for any sort of removal deck to really deal with, because Fizz's unique ability allows you to fizzle any removal aimed at him. So if there's a Vengeance, if there's a Vile Feast, if there's a Disintegrate plus Mystic Shot, whatever it may be, Fizz can simply fizzle out that spell using another spell that you cast at fast or burst speed. And this sort of combo deck definitely makes it very, very difficult for a lot of slower decks, a lot of more removal-centric decks, to actually defeat unless they are more of an aggressive burn style of deck, which then even then you still have a relatively low curve. You can go wide pretty easily, and you can still find random healing off of Phase Sprout into something like Tasty Faithful, for example. So definitely just a very, very annoying deck to beat for a lot of decks out there. I think this would probably remain up there for one of the highest power level, raw power level decks, in my opinion, but also probably one of the higher skill ceiling decks as well. If you guys want a little bit more of a guide on this deck, I did release a masterclass on this VIT deck, I believe last week or so, so feel free to check that one out if you're interested. To me, the only relatively bad matchup that I think is Thralls, simply because they have access to freezes, which can stop you on a combo turn, and then they can just rush you down on the next. They have Entomb, which allows them to actually obliterate your attach units should you not put it on exactly Fizz. And I think they can just race you a little bit faster. Now, a lot of my friends have been telling me that they think that the Fizz Riven deck is favored, at least more favored than the Fizz Aphelios list, which I can agree with. But I still think the matchup into Thralls is a little bit tough. But outside of Thralls and maybe just some very specific burn-based aggro decks, I think Fizz Riven is probably, in my opinion, the best deck in the format. And then for the fourth deck, rounding out the meta as what I think is probably the best deck, not in terms of the best raw power level deck, but I think the best deck with the deck with the best well-rounded matchup tables into the entire meta. And this is Zoe, Aphelios. Vi is optional, but it's Zoe, Aphelios plus Winding Light in PNZ. And this deck, which will transition into some actually pretty similar decks, and I'll kind of talk about the structure of why I think these sort of decks are popular right now, is a very go wide deck. It's actually very aggressive, despite the PNZ plus Targan pairing that a lot of people associate with slower value oriented tempo / control decks. This one aims to kill you between turns 5 to 7. And they can do that by going with a very wide board. If you take a closer look at this sort of deck list, it very closely resembles something like Draven Sion. You have the Boon Baboon, you have Urchin, you have Spacey Sketcher, you have 10 1-drops in your arsenal. And you even main deck Flame Chompers. You can go very wide with this deck to push early damage by dragging decks that maybe only play 1 or 2 units, and you can pull them out of the way with something like a Flame Chompers, get in for early damage, drop Winding Light, and then all of a sudden, not many cards in the game actually deal with a Winding Light board, apart from cards like Bury Nice or Ruination. And this allows you to pull in for a very strong tempo swing on the turn you drop Winding Light. And of course, this can be discounted with either the Dust Petal off of Lunari Dustbringer, or from Moonsilver off of Zoe, which allows you to even cheat it out even earlier. And of course, the second component that does make these sort of aggressive decks work is our ability to have burn in the deck. With 3 copies of Mystic Shot as well as 3 copies of Get Excited, that additional burn allows us to be more aggressive with our game plan. And then even if it's our opponent's attack turn, we still have a way of ending the game by shooting their Nexus with a little bit of burn. I think what makes this deck really cool is despite its relatively aggressive game plan, it still has ways of playing a slow game, a more drawn out value game, just because of the fact that we are playing out Aphelios. This champion alone can just grind out the game by itself, slow down the game completely by going Calibrum into Gravitum into Crescendum, and just generate a lot of value for yourself until you can grind out your opponent, and then just turn the tides and swing back with a couple units of your own. So this is probably up there for my favorite deck right now. It's just very flexible in its game plan. It has components which I think are very powerful enough to actually race decks like Thralls, beat up decks like TF or Fizz Riven, and have a chance into Viego as well. So I think very interesting spreads. High skill ceiling as well, but I think just very even throughout. If you're looking for a deck that you can confidently pilot at a high level and want to climb with, this is probably the deck that I would recommend right now. And now for the next 4 decks, we'll kind of get into some more interesting ones and ones that have been shifting in and out of the meta just based as a response of what they're seeing. And the first one here is Azir Irelia. I think for obvious reasons, the Azir Irelia into Thralls matchup is basically unlosable. It's something like 80-20 or like 70-30 at worst. It's basically built to beat up Thralls, and of course it has the added benefit of beating up slower control decks, any sort of like SI control deck, Feel the Rush, Jayceheimer, things like that. Any like Whale deck, for example, just gets absolutely blown out of the waters by this Azir Deus combo. This deck has had some new additions, which I think is quite cool. The addition of Shadow Apprentice recently changed to having +1 attack for every ephemeral summon the round, makes it just a very good aggressive tool early on, and you can have some really sick combos with it. It's sort of like a side grade to Sparring Student, but it does come with the fact that it is an elusive attacker. The second card we have here is Stagehand. Not only is it an ephemeral that buffs cards like Shadow Apprentice, it can serve as a block deterrent because it's ephemeral and your opponent doesn't really want to attack into it, but it can also just be used very aggressively as an offensive stun card. Because when you blade attack, or maybe you blade attack multiple times in a turn, your opponent might have like a pretty big unit that allows them to block multiple times in the same turn, but now you can just Stagehand, stun that unit, and then blade dance a couple times that turn, and then ensure that unit just can't block, which I think is a really flexible and interesting addition to the deck that I think is really, really sweet. Again, this deck mainly is in the meta to target some very, very specific decks. If you run into any sort of other decks that you're not targeting, you're going to have a pretty rough time. But the reason why we are seeing a little bit more Azir Irelia into the meta, if you have been seeing it, is specifically because of its matchups in the Thrall, and I think some other slower control decks as well. So this is kind of interesting phasing in and out. Power level wise, I think it's actually pretty decent. The ability to high roll something like Azir and Deus on an early turn into a couple blade dances is really something that not a lot of decks can really handle with that aren't specifically Demacia based decks. And it can kind of just dumpster all over you. So definitely a deck that I think is interesting. Probably not suited the best for ladder play, but if you are running into purely Thralls, because it is the most played deck on ladder, this is a fantastic counter for that. Another really interesting deck that has come into the meta as a result of Thralls is this burn deck that just recently hit rank 1. This is Annie Ziggs Katarina. And this is a Shrima Noxus burn based aggro deck. And for a very lot of similar reasons why I think the Zoe Aphelios Winding Light deck is strong, I think burn based decks are pretty strong right now as well. The ability to go wide on board without having too many things to punish you, and then having the burn to finish the game is in a very, very strong position right now. Viego decks as well as Thrall decks are very susceptible to being burned out early on because they generally have pretty weak beginning turns, Thralls just kind of dirtles around with their setup on their frozen Thralls, and the Viego deck has really weak turn 4s, and this opens up for a lot of aggressive decks to sort of abuse the fact that they have a few slower turns in their game plan and just really open the path for a very aggressive board state. Now, the stream of cards also have an additional of having fearsome blockers, as well as cards like Merciless Hunter, which can grant vulnerable and challenge units out of the way, and Ruin Runner, which has Spell Shield and Overwhelm. And these just provide very premium targets that make aggro decks just really, really sweet. It's a little bit slower than maybe the traditional Pirates or the Spiders deck, but I think that weakness is held up by having the additional top end of cards like Ruin Runner, the burn and the big body from Ziggs, and Ruinous Path, which is actually pretty sweet, allowing you to draw and burn in the same card. So this deck recently hit rank 1, and I think it's a little surprise that burn-based decks right now are actually pretty decent. The seventh deck that I wanted to feature here is Bard Galio. I am still sort of skeptical on the deck, but it has been represented in the meta, and I think is slowly gaining a little bit more track and popularity. I think something like 3 Galios is definitely more of the way to go, just having a stronger top end to have better ways of ending the game after you curve out pretty early on. But generally speaking, the Demacia has a part into the meta. It's purely because of their ability to summon a lot of challenger units, having Petricide Broadwing as well as Silverwing Vanguard, and in addition to that, being able to buff them up with either Chimes or Durant Sculptor makes it very annoying for a lot of these spready go-wide decks. The Fizz Riven, the Azir Irelia, the Zoe Vi deck, or the Zoe Aphelios Winding Light deck. These are decks that really fold in the presence of Petricide Broadwing, especially if it has 4 health, or even more because it's buffed by Sharpsight, or then it gets a Galio buff. It just creates some very, very sticky units that allows them to control a lot of these board-wide swarm decks and gain advantage because you're often not value trading into them just because your challenger units are so big and your opponent's units are so small. And of course, it has the addition of rallies, which again, quite not many decks can deal with, especially because this deck specifically rallies based off of Galio flip. There is 1 Golden Aegis in this list, but once Galio flips, the game just becomes a lot harder. Not only does Galio have Spell Shield itself, it just buffs up all the units around him. And right now, there really isn't many cards such as Ruination or other board sweepers around that I think this sort of deck can capitalize on, because there's no way to punish a wide board. There's just no Ruination, there's very few Bury and Ice, and this deck sort of gets to abuse this little pocket because there's a lot of decks that this actually does pretty well into. And I will say this deck is also another deck that can potentially outscale Thralls because you have Bard and Durant Sculptor. You can create some really big units off of the Chimes, off of the health buffs. You have Concerted Strike, you have Shielded Durant. There are ways to survive against Thralls, even if they are swinging into you, which I think is a relatively unique characteristic of a deck in this current format. And then finally, a deck that has been popping up a little bit. It just has a pretty high win rate, but a very low play rate. I'm gonna presume that's more because of good players playing a deck that is targeting things in the meta, but I think for the same reasons that some other decks I showcased in this video are good right now, Draven Sion fits that format superbly. It has a go wide game plan early on, and it has burn to end out the game. This kind of strategy, again, is specifically focused on decks like Thralls and Viego, but this sort of aggressive game plan can actually also try to abuse some of the slower Demacia decks, the Fizz Riven, the Zoe Fi, Aphelios. Like, this sort of game plan is overall, I think, is probably in the strongest position right now in the meta, where very little healing in the game, very few board-based removal cards in the game, and just having a go wide fearsome plus challenger things is something that's very, very strong. And a lot of decks that I showcase in this video are really abusing this strategy. You have the Zoe via Aphelios, which go wide, has burn, has overwhelm win condition. The burn deck from the Annie Ziggs, go wide, burn, more burn. And then this Draven Sion deck, has Go Wide, Burn, and then Scion finish for a little bit of Overwhelm, which also gives a little bit more value and protection against some of the slower decks as well. So I think this sort of formula of decks are very strong right now. If you're looking for some decks that, or if you know some decks that are similar to that, I think you should try them out right now, because I think leading up to the patch, these are going to be some of the strongest decks out there. So that's going to conclude the 8 decks that I'm going to showcase for this week. Before I do wrap up the video, I want to talk a little bit about the upcoming patch at the end of the month, which is in 2 weeks from when you are seeing this video. Because I want to talk a little bit, because there are people that come into this video like, hey, Jason, what deck should I build? Or I'm like new to the game, is it worth buying X deck? And I want to talk a little bit about some of the expected changes that we're expecting, so we can sort of set expectations. If you're new to the game and you're looking at this video and you're considering what decks you want to be building or want to be learning, this might put you in a different direction, or just having a concept of frame in your head. All right, we're here. This is on Twitter, which this picture has been posted on Reddit as well, but this is Ruben Zoo, one of the lead developers on the Legends of Runeterra balance team, is revealing about what's coming up in patch 3.10, which is coming at the end of the month. So a few highlights: 40 individual card changes, including nerfs to meta decks. I'm presuming this one is just a bunch of, I'll just read them out first. System changes: copies count and played, and generatable keywords. Copies count as played, I'm not quite sure what this means, but generated keywords I think is referring to specifically cards like Victor and Pantheon that generate random keywords, and a lot of people are speculating that the pool of keywords that you can generate off of are going to be changed. Such like, I think a good example is, say, Lucky Find, the card that you can get from the Shrima cards, doesn't have access to Elusive, doesn't have access to Scout. And that might be a similar direction that they want to lead to it, because when cards like Victor or Pantheon roll Scout or Elusive, that can be a very frustrating way to look at the game. And if that is the case, I think Pantheon will receive what I think is actually a relatively significant nerf. Victor a little bit less so, because I think in Victor decks overall, there's less Victor decks out there that aim to really abuse Victor in the same way. And now that it will just definitely reduce the high roll potential of these cards. But I think outside of specifically Pantheon, this change won't affect too many decks. The third one is interesting: buffs to landmark removal. Now this of course is aimed and set at Thralls, which is the most played deck, and they want to buff landmark removal. I don't know what this means. They're not going to add any new cards into the game. I'm not sure if they're going to reduce, say, the cost of Crumble from 5 to 4. That seems relatively absurd, but I'm very curious as to what this leads. It's unclear if they're actually going to touch Thralls or any card within it. If they are planning to buff landmark removal, I don't want to promise that Thralls will be unchanged, but just note that Thralls might have a little bit more of a thorn coming into the upcoming patch. So if you are eager to build or buy out Thralls, I would still say go for it, because in 2 weeks, that's a lot of time and you can do something else with the resources by then. But just be aware that there is a potential change in the upcoming patch that might nick Thralls a little bit. Now, I think relatively speaking, landmark removal has generally not been effective into the newer edition of Thralls, and I'm not sure really what kind of change could be very big and beneficial to make Thralls matchups worse, but I'm still interested to see. And then functional adjustments to Disintegrate. Don't really know what this means. Don't expect Disintegrate to get really wrecked in too much capacity, but this might be leaning towards like not working against tough or barriered units, which could be interesting. But overall, I think there's relatively little to worry about. I don't know, because like when we see like generatable keywords, you know, there's a couple of cards wrapped into this 40. So I think this number will be lower overall, but it'll be interesting to see what they actually hit. I can't promise anything right now, But as far as the meta goes for the next 2 weeks, I hopefully showed you guys 8 decks that I think are certified to be very good in climbing within ladder. So hopefully if you are familiar and comfortable with some of the decks that I showcased now, play them out for the next 2 weeks, because there will be a relatively significant balance patch. I don't know if these will significantly hinder the 8 decks that I've showed, but I think the general perception from the balance team, at least from what I've seen on Twitter, is that they're relatively happy with the meta and relatively happy with the current decks. So hopefully this video has helped, giving you a little bit more direction going into your next 2 weeks. If you're trying to climb, play some ladder. As usual, all the deck lists will be down below for the 8 decks. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you guys so much for making it all the way to the end. I'm sorry that I tucked this talk in at the very end, because this could be important, but I thank you if you did make it all the way. So I'll see you guys tomorrow for another deck video. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys later.